Have you ever witnessed a moment when someone you've never met steps in to protect a stranger's child? A moment that changes everything? Sometimes the most ordinary places become the stage for extraordinary courage, and sometimes that courage catches the attention of someone who can change your entire world. This is exactly what happened to Elena Rossi on a Tuesday night that started like any other but ended with her life taking an impossible turn. Elena wiped down the sticky table for the third time, her back aching from the double shift that had started 12 hours ago. At 24, she felt decades older, exhaustion settling into her bones like a familiar weight she could never quite shake off. The downtown restaurant where she worked was nothing special, the kind of place that served mediocre food to people who couldn't afford better, but it paid her rent and put her through nursing school 1 credit hour at a time. Her phone buzzed against her hip and she knew without looking it was probably another bill from her mother's doctors. Stage 3 breast cancer didn't come cheap, and even with insurance, the treatments were bleeding Elena dry. She dropped down to part-time at school again this semester, taking only the classes she could afford, stretching her graduation out another year. Every night she fell asleep doing the math, calculating how long her mother's savings would last, how many extra shifts she needed to pick up, how many meals she could skip to make the numbers work. Where are you watching from tonight? Maybe you know this kind of exhaustion, the weight of carrying more than you think you can handle. Drop a comment and let me know what state or country you're in, because this story proves that courage can surface anywhere, at any time. The dinner rush was finally winding down when Elena heard the commotion near table 7. Derek, the night manager, was standing over a small girl who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. His voice raised loud enough that other customers were starting to stare. The little girl had knocked over her chocolate milk, the brown liquid spreading across the white tablecloth and dripping onto the floor, and she was crying those silent tears that meant she was truly scared. "That's when you pay for a new tablecloth," Derek was saying, his face red with anger that seemed completely disproportionate to a simple accident. "You make a mess, you pay for it. Where's your father?" Elena felt something twist in her stomach as she watched the scene unfold. The little girl was beautiful, with dark curly hair and olive skin that suggested Italian heritage, dressed in expensive clothes that marked her as someone whose family could certainly afford to replace a tablecloth. But she was just a child, and Derek's tone was harsh enough to make even Elena flinch. The girl's father was nowhere to be seen, probably in the bathroom or taking a phone call, leaving his daughter to face Derek's unreasonable anger alone. "I'm sorry," the little girl whispered, her voice barely audible over the restaurant noise. "I didn't mean to." "Sorry doesn't clean up the mess," Derek snapped back. "Sorry doesn't pay for damages. You kids think you can destroy property and just say sorry." Elena abandoned her section and crossed the restaurant floor before she'd made a conscious decision to move. She'd grown up with a father who disappeared when things got difficult, leaving her and her mother to face every crisis alone. And something about seeing this child abandoned to Derek's cruelty made her chest burn with protective fury. "Excuse me," she said, stepping between Derek and the table, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Is there a problem here?" Derek turned his anger toward her, his eyes narrowing with the particular kind of malice he reserved for employees who dared to question his authority. "This little princess here destroyed restaurant property," he said, gesturing toward the small puddle of milk. "I was explaining the concept of consequences." Elena looked down at the girl, who had stopped crying but was still trembling slightly. She was genuinely beautiful, with intelligent dark eyes that seemed too old for her face, and Elena felt an immediate surge of protectiveness that surprised her with its intensity. "It's just a tablecloth," Elena said quietly, pulling her order pad from her apron pocket. "How much does the restaurant charge for tablecloth replacement?" $15, Derek said immediately, his tone suggesting he was making up the number on the spot. "Plus tip for the extra cleaning work. 25 total." Elena pulled her tips from her apron, the crumpled bills and loose change that represented hours of carrying plates and forcing smiles at rude customers. $25 was her grocery money for the next 3 days, but looking at the little girl's face, she knew she couldn't walk away. "Here," she said, counting out the money and placing it in Derek's outstretched hand. "The bill's covered." She knelt down next to the girl's chair, bringing herself to eye level. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Sophia," the girl whispered, her voice still shaky from crying. "That's a beautiful name. I'm Elena. Would you like me to help clean this up?" Elena grabbed a handful of napkins from the dispenser and began soaking up the spilled milk, her movements gentle and efficient. Sophia watched her with wide eyes, as if she couldn't quite believe that a stranger was helping her instead of yelling at her. "Accidents happen to everyone," Elena said softly, making sure only Sophia could hear her. "You don't need to be afraid of making mistakes. That's how we learn." As she worked, Elena became aware that someone was watching them. She glanced up to see a man sitting alone in the corner booth, and something about his presence made her pause. He was probably in his mid-30s, tall even while seated, with dark hair and expensive clothes that stood out in their modest restaurant. His suit was clearly tailored, the kind that cost more than Elena made in 3 months, and there was something about the way other customers unconsciously gave his table a wide berth that suggested he was someone important. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, dark and intense, focused entirely on the interaction between Elena and Sophia. Elena finished cleaning the spill and stood up, disposing of the soaked napkins in a nearby trash bin. When she turned back, Sophia was looking up at her with something approaching worship in her young eyes. "Thank you," Sophia said, her voice stronger now. "You're really nice." "You're very welcome," Elena replied, reaching out to gently squeeze the girl's hand. "Don't let anyone make you feel bad for accidents. Okay? You seem like a wonderful little girl." That's when she heard footsteps approaching, and Elena looked up to see that the man from the corner booth was walking toward them. Up close, he was even more imposing than she'd initially thought. Well over 6 feet with broad shoulders and the kind of confident presence that seemed to command attention without effort. His face was classically handsome in the way that suggested Italian heritage, with sharp cheekbones and a strong jaw, but it was his eyes that held her attention. They were dark brown, almost black, and they were looking at her with an intensity that made her suddenly self-conscious. Sophia jumped up from her chair and ran to him, wrapping her small arms around his waist with obvious relief and affection. "Papa," she said, her voice muffled against his suit jacket. "The lady helped me when the mean man was yelling." The man's hand came down to rest gently on Sophia's head, his touch tender despite his intimidating appearance. When he looked back at Elena, there was something new in his expression, something that looked almost like gratitude mixed with surprise. "I saw what happened," he said, his voice deep with a slight Italian accent that made Elena's pulse quicken inexplicably. "Thank you for protecting my daughter." Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks as the full situation dawned on her. This wasn't just any customer. This was clearly someone wealthy and powerful, someone whose child she just defended against her own manager. The smart thing to do would be to excuse herself and return to work, to pretend this interaction had never happened. But looking at Sophia's face, seeing the way the little girl was smiling up at her with genuine warmth, Elena knew she'd make the same choice again in a heartbeat. "It was nothing," she said, though they both knew that wasn't true. "She's a sweet girl. No one should talk to a child that way." The man studied her for a long moment, and Elena had the strangest feeling that he was seeing something in her that she didn't even know existed. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet but carried an unmistakable authority. "I don't think we've been properly introduced. I'm Vincent Torino, and this is my daughter Sophia." "Elena Rossi," she replied, accepting his offered handshake and trying not to notice how large and warm his hand was, or how the simple touch seemed to send electricity up her arm. "Ms. Rossi," Vincent said, and the way he said her name made it sound almost elegant. "I think you and I need to talk." Elena felt her heart hammering against her ribs as Vincent Torino continued to study her with those impossibly dark eyes. There was something about his presence that made the noisy restaurant fade into background noise, as if the entire world had suddenly narrowed down to this moment, this conversation. This man whose daughter she just protected from Derek's cruelty. "I'd like to speak with you privately, if possible," Vincent said, his voice carrying an authority that suggested he was accustomed to having his requests honored immediately. "Would you be available after your shift ends?" Elena glanced around the restaurant, suddenly aware that other customers were watching their interaction with poorly concealed curiosity. Vincent Torino's presence had shifted the entire atmosphere of the room, and she could see recognition flickering across several faces. Whoever this man was, he was clearly someone important, someone whose appearance in their modest restaurant was noteworthy. "I don't get off until midnight," she said, her voice sounding smaller than she'd intended. The late shift always ran long because Derek insisted on thorough cleaning before anyone could leave. "That won't be a problem," Vincent replied, settling back into his booth with Sophia climbing onto the seat beside him. "We'll wait." Elena felt a flutter of panic mixed with intrigue. In her 24 years, no one had ever waited 3 hours just to speak with her, especially not someone who looked like he could buy and sell everything she'd ever owned without checking his bank balance. She wanted to ask what this was about, wanted to understand why defending his daughter had earned her this kind of attention, but Derek was already shooting pointed looks in her direction from across the restaurant. "I should get back to work," she said reluctantly. "My manager doesn't like it when we spend too much time chatting with customers." Vincent's gaze followed hers to Derek, who was now standing behind the counter with his arms crossed, radiating the particular kind of petty authority that made Elena's stomach twist with familiar anxiety. She'd learned to read Derek's moods over the past 2 years, learned to anticipate his anger and navigate around it. But tonight something felt different. Tonight, Derek's usual irritation seemed sharpened by the fact that Elena had publicly contradicted him in front of a customer. Elena returned to her section, trying to focus on wiping down tables and refilling salt shakers, but she found herself stealing glances at Vincent and Sophia throughout the evening. They seemed completely comfortable waiting, Sophia working on what appeared to be homework while Vincent made occasional phone calls, his voice too low for Elena to overhear the conversations. There was something mesmerizing about watching him with his daughter, the way his entire demeanor softened when he helped her with a math problem or listened to her chatter about school. It was clear that despite his intimidating presence, Vincent Torino was a devoted father. Around 10:30, Derek made his move. Elena was carrying a tray of dirty dishes to the kitchen when he intercepted her. His face twisted with the cruel satisfaction that meant he was about to make her night significantly worse. "Funny how you found $25 to cover that kid's damages," he said, blocking her path to the kitchen. "Real convenient that you had spare cash lying around when I've been telling you for months that your section's performance has been slipping." Elena felt her cheeks burn with humiliation. She'd hoped Derek would let the incident slide, but she should have known better. Derek never forgot a slight, real or imagined, and her intervention earlier had clearly wounded his pride. "My section performance is fine," she said quietly, not wanting to cause a scene with Vincent and Sophia still in the dining room. "I've never had any complaints from customers." "Maybe that's because you're too busy making friends instead of doing your job," Derek snapped, his voice loud enough that several nearby customers turned to stare. "Maybe you need a reminder about what your priorities should be around here." Elena's hands tightened on the tray of dishes as Derek continued his tirade, listing imaginary infractions and threatened consequences that they both knew were designed to humiliate rather than correct any actual problems. She'd endured these power plays before, had learned to keep her head down and wait for Derek's anger to burn itself out, but tonight felt different. Tonight, she was acutely aware that Vincent was watching the interaction, and something about his presence made Derek's bullying seem even more degrading than usual. What she didn't notice was Vincent rising from his booth, his movement smooth and purposeful as he approached their confrontation. She didn't see the way other customers instinctively stepped aside to clear his path, or the way Derek's expression shifted from cruel satisfaction to nervous confusion as Vincent drew near. "Is there a problem here?" Vincent asked, his voice calm but carrying an undertone that made Derek take an involuntary step backward. "No problem at all," Derek said quickly, his tone suddenly deferential in a way that Elena had never heard before. "Just discussing scheduling with one of my employees." "I see," Vincent said, his dark eyes moving from Derek to Elena and back again. "Ms. Rossi, would you mind joining Sophia and me at our table? I believe your manager and I have some business to discuss." Elena looked between the two men, confused by the sudden shift in dynamics. Derek's face had gone pale, and he was nodding rapidly at something Vincent had said too quietly for her to hear. Whatever was happening, it was clear that Derek recognized Vincent as someone whose displeasure carried serious consequences. Actually, Vincent continued, his voice rising slightly so that other customers could hear him clearly. I've been thinking about making some investments in the local restaurant industry. This establishment has caught my attention tonight. Elena watched in stunned silence as Vincent pulled out his phone and made a brief call, speaking in rapid Italian that she couldn't understand but that seemed to galvanize whoever was on the other end of the line. Within minutes, a man in an expensive suit appeared at the restaurant entrance, carrying a briefcase and looking like the kind of lawyer who charged more per hour than Elena made in a week. Derek's transformation was remarkable to witness. The same man who'd been terrorizing her moments earlier was now practically trembling as Vincent's lawyer spread documents across a nearby table and began explaining terms of sale in language that suggested this wasn't a negotiation so much as a foregone conclusion. Elena realized with growing amazement that Vincent Torino was buying the entire restaurant. Right here, right now, apparently for the sole purpose of addressing Derek's behavior. The paperwork took less than an hour. Elena watched from behind the counter as Derek signed document after document, his hands shaking slightly as he transferred ownership of the restaurant to Vincent's organization. When the final signature was complete, Vincent stood up and addressed Derek with the same calm authority he'd maintained throughout the entire process. Your employment here is terminated immediately, he said simply. Security will escort you out. Derek left without another word, his exit so swift and silent that Elena almost wondered if she'd imagined the entire confrontation. Suddenly, she was standing in a restaurant that Vincent Torino now owned, surrounded by customers who were whispering among themselves about what they'd just witnessed, and she had absolutely no idea what any of this meant for her future. Vincent approached her slowly, Sophia holding his hand and looking up at Elena with obvious admiration. I apologize for the dramatic nature of tonight's events, he said, his voice gentler now that Derek was gone. But I couldn't stand by and watch someone treat you that way after what you did for Sophia. Elena stared at him, trying to process the magnitude of what had just happened. You bought an entire restaurant because my manager was being rude to me? Partly, Vincent admitted, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. But mostly because I have a proposition for you, and I needed to ensure you'd be free to consider it without worrying about Derek's retaliation. He gestured toward their booth, and Elena found herself following him, her legs moving automatically while her mind struggled to catch up with the surreal turn her evening had taken. Ms. Rossi, Vincent said once they were seated, Sophia has been without a proper caregiver since her mother died 2 years ago. My mother helps when she can, but Sophia needs someone younger, someone who can give her the attention and care she deserves. After watching how you handled the situation tonight, I believe you might be exactly what she needs. Elena felt her breath catch in her throat. Are you offering me a job? I'm offering you a position as Sophia's live-in nanny, Vincent said, his dark eyes serious. The salary would be $80,000 per year, plus room and board at my estate, plus a signing bonus sufficient to cover any outstanding educational or medical expenses you might have. Elena's mind reeled with the impossibility of the offer. $80,000 was more than 3 times what she made at the restaurant, enough to finish nursing school without working, enough to cover her mother's treatments without the constant crushing anxiety about money. It was everything she'd been desperately hoping for, wrapped up in an offer that seemed too good to be true. Why me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. You don't even know me. Vincent's expression softened as he looked at his daughter, who was coloring quietly beside him. I know that when you saw a child being mistreated, you didn't hesitate to step in. Even though it cost you money you couldn't afford and put your job at risk, he said quietly. I know that you treated Sophia with more kindness in 5 minutes than most people show their own children. And I know that my daughter is already half in love with you, which hasn't happened with anyone since her mother died. Elena looked at Sophia, who was peeking at her shyly over her coloring book, and felt something twist in her chest. The little girl was beautiful and obviously intelligent, but there was a loneliness in her eyes that Elena recognized from her own childhood. Growing up with an absent father had left scars that Elena still carried, and she could see that Sophia was struggling with loss that no 80-year-old should have to bear. The practical part of Elena's mind was screaming warnings about accepting offers that seemed too good to be true, about getting involved with powerful men whose business dealings required lawyers to appear at a moment's notice, about stepping into situations she didn't fully understand. But the exhausted, desperate part of her mind was calculating how many of her problems this job would solve, how much worry it would eliminate from her daily existence. I would need to give 2 weeks' notice, she heard herself saying, as if her mouth had made the decision without consulting her brain. Vincent's smile was genuine and transformative, changing his entire face from intimidating to almost boyishly pleased. 2 weeks won't be necessary, he said. As of tonight, you no longer work here. You can start with us tomorrow if you're willing. Elena took a deep breath, looking around the restaurant that had represented security and stability for the past 2 years, even if it had also represented exhaustion and Derek's casual cruelty. Tomorrow, she would wake up in a new life, with a new job, in the home of a man whose last name she'd learned only hours ago. It was terrifying and exhilarating and completely insane. It was also exactly what she and her mother needed. Okay, she said finally, meeting Vincent's dark gaze with as much courage as she could muster. I accept your offer, Mr. Torino. Welcome to the family, Elena, Vincent said quietly, and something about the way he said her name made her believe that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't even begin to imagine. Elena's first glimpse of Vincent's estate came as his black sedan wound through wrought iron gates that looked like they belonged guarding a palace. The driveway stretched for what felt like miles through manicured gardens and towering oak trees, finally revealing a house that made her stomach drop with its sheer magnitude. It wasn't just large, it was magnificent in a way that spoke of generations of wealth and power, the kind of European-inspired architecture that belonged in magazines rather than reality. 3 stories of honey-colored stone rose before them, with tall windows that gleamed in the afternoon sunlight and terraces that overlooked grounds so perfectly maintained they looked almost artificial. Elena had grown up in a 2-bedroom apartment where the neighbors' arguments came through the thin walls every night, and now she was supposed to live in a place that could house 50 families without anyone bumping into each other. It's really big, Sophia said from beside her, apparently reading Elena's expression with the perceptiveness that seemed to characterize children who'd grown up in adult situations. Papa likes having lots of space because he needs quiet when he works. Elena wondered what kind of work required this level of security and isolation. But before she could voice the question, Vincent was helping them out of the car and leading them toward massive front doors that opened before they reached them. A uniformed man appeared to take Elena's single suitcase, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks as she realized how inadequate her possessions must seem in this setting. The interior was even more overwhelming than the exterior. The foyer alone was larger than most people's living rooms, with marble floors that reflected light from a crystal chandelier that probably cost more than Elena had made in her entire life. Everything was elegant and expensive and perfect, the kind of showcase that belonged in architectural magazines, and Elena felt suddenly conscious of her discount store clothes and scuffed shoes. Elena, I'd like you to meet my mother, Vincent said, his voice carrying across the space as an elegant woman descended the curved staircase with the grace of someone who'd been raised in luxury. Isabella Torino was probably in her early 60s, with silver hair styled impeccably and clothes that screamed European designer. She was beautiful in the way that spoke of good genetics maintained by expensive care, but her dark eyes were sharp with intelligence and what Elena suspected was skepticism about this new arrangement. So you're the young woman who's captured my son's attention, Isabella said, her voice carrying a slight Italian accent and a tone that suggested judgment was being reserved pending further evidence. Elena felt her cheeks burn as she realized the older woman's implication. Mrs. Torino, I want to assure you that my interest here is purely professional. I'm here to care for Sophia, nothing more. Isabella's expression softened slightly, as if Elena's directness had earned her a few points. Of course, dear. Vincent has told me about your kindness toward Sophia at that dreadful restaurant. Any woman who would protect a child from such treatment is welcome in this house. The tour of Elena's quarters left her speechless. What Vincent called the guest suite was actually a collection of rooms that included a bedroom larger than her entire apartment, a sitting area with French doors that opened onto a private terrace, and a bathroom with a marble tub deep enough to swim in. The closet was already stocked with clothes in her size, designer pieces that still had tags attached, as if Vincent had anticipated her needs with unsettling accuracy. "I took the liberty of having some things purchased for you," Vincent said, his voice careful as he watched her examine a silk blouse that cost more than she used to make in a week. "If anything doesn't suit you, it can be exchanged." Elena ran her fingers over the soft fabric, torn between gratitude and discomfort at accepting such expensive gifts. "This is too much," she said quietly. "I can't accept all of this." Vincent stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne and feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Elena," he said, his voice dropping to that low tone that made her pulse quicken inexplicably, "you're living in my home to care for the most important person in my world. This isn't charity, it's ensuring that you have everything you need to do your job properly." Her first day with Sophia revealed depths of loneliness that broke Elena's heart. The little girl was polite and intelligent, but there was a careful quality to her interactions, as if she'd learned not to expect too much attention or affection from the adults in her life. She had elaborate routines for entertaining herself, imaginary friends that she spoke to when she thought Elena wasn't listening, and a heartbreaking tendency to apologize for normal childhood needs like wanting snacks or help with homework. Elena found herself falling into easy patterns with Sophia, helping her with math problems at the kitchen table, braiding her hair before dinner, reading bedtime stories that stretched longer than necessary because Sophia kept finding reasons to ask just one more question. The little girl seemed starved for maternal attention, and Elena felt something fierce and protective awakening in her chest as she watched Sophia blossom under consistent care and affection. It was during their second evening that Elena got her first real glimpse into Vincent's world beyond fatherhood. She was helping Sophia with a science project in the kitchen when she heard voices from Vincent's study, low and serious in a way that made her pause in cutting construction paper. Through the partially open door, she could see Vincent seated behind a massive desk, while three men in expensive suits stood before him like supplicants awaiting judgment. The conversation was in Italian, but Elena caught enough words to understand they were discussing money, territory, and someone who had apparently failed to honor some kind of agreement. Vincent's voice remained calm throughout, but there was something in his tone that made Elena's skin prickle with awareness that this wasn't a normal business meeting. When one of the men raised his voice slightly, Vincent's response was sharp enough that all three visitors immediately fell silent. "Elena, are you okay?" Sophia asked, looking up from her volcano model with concern. "You look worried." Elena forced herself to smile and return her attention to the project, but her mind was racing with new questions about exactly what kind of business Vincent conducted from his elegant home office. The men who'd visited him looked like the kind of people she'd cross the street to avoid, and their deferential behavior suggested that Vincent held significant power over them. Later that evening, after Sophia was asleep and Elena was wandering the kitchen looking for tea, Vincent appeared in the doorway still wearing his business clothes but with his tie loosened and his sleeves rolled up. The domestic setting made him seem more approachable, but Elena found herself hyper-aware of his presence in a way that made her hands tremble slightly as she filled the kettle. "How was your first day with Sophia?" he asked, moving to the cabinet to retrieve 2 mugs without being asked, as if he'd assumed she would welcome his company. "She's wonderful," Elena said honestly. "Lonely but wonderful. She's incredibly bright and sweet, but I think she's been taking care of herself emotionally for too long." Vincent's expression grew thoughtful as he leaned against the counter, his dark eyes focused on Elena's face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Since her mother died, I've struggled to know how to be both father and mother to her. My work requires travel, late hours, situations that aren't appropriate for a child. I've tried to give her stability, but I know it hasn't been enough." The vulnerability in his admission surprised Elena. This was the same man who'd commanded instant obedience from dangerous-looking visitors just hours earlier. But when he talked about Sophia, his careful control cracked enough to reveal genuine uncertainty and pain. "You're doing better than you think," Elena said softly, moving closer without conscious thought. "She loves you completely. She just needs someone to help fill in the gaps, and that's what I'm here for." They were standing close enough now that Elena could see the exhaustion in Vincent's eyes, the weight of responsibilities that went far beyond normal parenting. When he reached past her to retrieve honey from the cabinet, his arm brushed against hers, and Elena felt an electric shock of awareness that had nothing to do with the situation and everything to do with him. For a moment they stood frozen, Elena's breath catching in her throat as Vincent's gaze dropped to her lips and back to her eyes. The air between them seemed charged with possibility, with an attraction that Elena knew was dangerous and inappropriate and completely beyond her control. Then Vincent stepped back, his expression carefully neutral once again, and the moment dissolved like mist. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice rougher than usual, "for caring about her the way you do. I can already see the difference you're making." Elena nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady if she spoke. As Vincent left the kitchen with his tea, she remained standing by the counter, her heart pounding with the realization that her feelings for her new employer were becoming far more complicated than simple professional gratitude. Living in Vincent's house meant being surrounded by evidence of his wealth and power, but it also meant witnessing the small moments of tenderness between him and Sophia that revealed the man beneath the intimidating exterior. Elena found herself looking forward to dinner time when Vincent would join them, his entire demeanor softening as he listened to Sophia's stories about school and helped her practice piano. During those moments, they felt like a real family, and Elena had to remind herself that she was an employee, not a permanent part of their lives. But late at night, lying in her luxurious guest suite and listening to the sounds of the enormous house settling around her, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that she was falling into something far deeper and more dangerous than a simple childcare position. Vincent Torino was clearly involved in business that existed outside the law, but when he looked at her across the dinner table or smiled at something Sophia said, Elena felt herself wanting to ignore every red flag and warning sign. She was beginning to understand that protecting her heart might prove far more challenging than protecting his daughter. 3 weeks into her new life, Elena found herself settling into rhythms she'd never expected to experience. Mornings with Sophia were filled with laughter and breakfast conversations that stretched longer than necessary because Elena genuinely enjoyed the little girl's chatter about school and friends and the elaborate fantasy worlds she created. Evenings often included Vincent when his work schedule allowed, and those dinners had become the highlights of Elena's days. Moments when they felt less like employer and employee and more like something dangerously close to an actual family. It was during one of those quiet evening conversations, after Sophia had gone upstairs to read before bed, that Elena found herself sharing more about her past than she'd intended. She and Vincent were lingering over coffee in the kitchen, the comfortable domestic setting making her feel safer and more relaxed than she had in years. "I never really had a normal family growing up," she admitted, staring into her mug rather than meeting Vincent's eyes. "My father left when I was 7, just disappeared one day without explanation or goodbye. My mother tried to pretend it didn't matter, that we were better off without him, but I could see how much it hurt her." Vincent's attention was completely focused on her, his dark eyes serious and patient in a way that encouraged her to continue. She'd never had someone listen to her with such intensity, as if her words mattered more than anything else in the world. "For years, I kept thinking he'd come back, that maybe he was just working somewhere far away and couldn't contact us. I used to watch for him at school events, convinced he'd show up and everything would be normal again. It took me until high school to accept that he'd chosen to abandon us, that we weren't worth staying for." Elena felt tears threatening and took a shaky breath, surprised by how much the old pain could still affect her. "I think that's part of why I was so determined to become a nurse, to have a career where I could take care of people, where I'd never have to depend on someone else to stay." Vincent reached across the table and covered her hand with his, the simple touch sending warmth up her arm and making her look up to meet his gaze. "He was a fool," Vincent said quietly, his voice rough with something that sounded like anger on her behalf. "Any man who could walk away from you and your mother was a fool who didn't deserve either of you." The sincerity in his voice made Elena's chest tighten with emotion she wasn't prepared to handle. She'd spent years convincing herself that her father's abandonment was just something that happened, not a reflection of her worth. But hearing Vincent's fierce defense of her stirred feelings she'd buried long ago. "What about you?" she asked, needing to shift the focus away from her own vulnerabilities. "You mentioned that Sophia lost her mother. Was she your wife?" Vincent's expression grew distant, and Elena could see him deciding how much to reveal. "She wasn't my wife," he said finally. "She was my brother's wife, Sophia's mother. Marco was 3 years younger than me, and when he met Carmen, I thought he'd finally found something that would help him grow up and take responsibility." Elena heard the pain in Vincent's voice and found herself leaning closer, drawn by the vulnerability he rarely showed. "They were both killed in a car accident when Sophia was 6, Vincent continued, his thumb stroking across Elena's knuckles in what seemed like an unconscious gesture. "Marco had been drinking, despite everything I tried to do to help him get clean. Carmen died because of his choices, and Sophia lost both parents in one night. I never planned to be a father," Vincent admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "My life, my work, it's not compatible with raising a child. But when I saw Sophia at the hospital, so small and lost and terrified, I knew I couldn't let her go into the system. She's all I have left of Marco, and she deserves better than his mistakes cost her." Elena felt her heart breaking for both of them. For the little girl who'd lost her parents so tragically, and for the man who'd stepped up to care for her despite his own fears and limitations. She turned her hand over beneath Vincent's, threading their fingers together in a gesture of comfort that felt natural despite the electricity it sent through her entire body. "You're a wonderful father," she said firmly. "Sophia adores you, and more importantly, she feels safe with you. That's not something you can fake or force. She knows you love her." Vincent's eyes met hers, and Elena saw something shift in his expression, a vulnerability that made her breath catch in her throat. The kitchen around them seemed to fade away as they sat holding hands across the table, connected by shared stories and an attraction that was becoming impossible to ignore. "Elena," he said, her name sounding different in his voice, rougher and more intimate than she'd ever heard it before. "I need you to know that having you here, watching you with Sophia, it's changing everything for me." Before Elena could respond, before she could process what Vincent's admission might mean, they heard small footsteps on the stairs and Sophia appeared in the doorway wearing purple pajamas and clutching a stuffed elephant. "I had a bad dream," Sophia said, her voice still thick with sleep and fear. "Can I have some water?" The spell between Elena and Vincent broke as they both immediately focused on Sophia's needs. But Elena could feel the weight of unfinished conversation hanging in the air between them. As she got Sophia water and walked her back upstairs, tucking her into bed with extra hugs and reassurances, Elena's mind raced with the implications of what had almost happened in the kitchen. Over the following days, Elena found herself hyper-aware of Vincent's presence in ways that had nothing to do with her job responsibilities. She noticed how his shirt stretched across his shoulders when he reached for something in a high cabinet, the way his rare smiles transformed his entire face, the gentle tone his voice took on when he spoke to Sophia. Living in his house meant being surrounded by reminders of his appeal, and Elena was beginning to realize that her attraction to him was far stronger than anything she'd ever experienced before. It was during her 4th week that the first signs of trouble appeared. Elena was walking back from the small market in town, where she'd taken Sophia for ice cream, when she noticed a familiar figure lurking near the estate's gates. Derek looked different than she remembered, unkempt and angry in a way that made her stomach twist with unease. When she made eye contact with him through the car window, his expression shifted into something that looked dangerously close to rage. Elena drove past without acknowledging him, but her hands were shaking as she punched in the gate code and hurried up the driveway. She told herself she was overreacting, that Derek had probably just been walking in the area and happened to be near the gates by coincidence. But she couldn't shake the feeling that his presence there hadn't been accidental. Over the next few days, Elena found herself checking over her shoulder more often, looking for familiar faces in crowds, feeling jumpy in ways that reminded her of the months after her father had left when every knock on the door had made her mother freeze with anxiety. When Vincent asked her during dinner if everything was all right, Elena considered telling him about seeing Derek, but the conversation was interrupted by Sophia's excitement about an upcoming school play, and the moment passed. The call from her mother's doctor came on a Thursday afternoon, while Elena was helping Sophia with homework. The news was devastating. Her mother's cancer had spread despite the treatments, and the oncologist was recommending an experimental therapy that would cost far more than Elena's new salary could cover, even with the generous benefits Vincent provided. Elena excused herself and took the call in her suite, trying to keep her voice steady as the doctor explained treatment options and timelines and costs that might as well have been astronomical. By the time she hung up, she was fighting back tears of frustration and fear that threatened to overwhelm her completely. She was sitting on her bed staring at the financial information she'd scribbled during the call when Vincent knocked on her door. Elena quickly wiped her eyes and tried to compose herself, but one look at her face told Vincent that something was seriously wrong. "What's happened?" he asked, his voice immediately sharp with concern as he stepped into her suite without waiting for permission. Elena found herself telling him everything, the words spilling out between tears that she couldn't control anymore. She explained about her mother's condition, the new treatment options, the crushing reality that even with her improved financial situation, she still couldn't afford the care her mother needed. Vincent listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker as Elena described the impossible choices she was facing. When she finished talking, he moved to sit beside her on the bed, his presence solid and comforting in a way that made her want to lean into his strength. "How much?" he asked simply. Elena shook her head. "Vincent, I wasn't telling you this to ask for money. You've already done more for me than I could ever repay." "That wasn't what I asked," he said gently, reaching out to cup her face in his hands and use his thumbs to wipe away the tears that were still falling. "How much does your mother need?" Elena told him the figure, watching his expression for signs of shock or hesitation, but Vincent's face remained calm and determined. "Consider it done," he said, pulling out his phone and making a call in rapid Italian that Elena couldn't follow, but that seemed to involve transferring large amounts of money immediately. "Vincent, no," Elena protested, even as relief flooded through her at the possibility that her mother might get the treatment she needed. "This is too much. I can't accept this kind of help." Vincent ended his call and focused his full attention on Elena, his dark eyes intense with something that made her pulse race despite her emotional turmoil. "Elena," he said, his voice dropping to that low, intimate tone that made her feel like the most important person in his world. "I would give you anything you needed, anything at all, because losing you would destroy both Sophia and me. Your mother will have the best care available, and you don't ever need to worry about money again." Before Elena could protest or argue or even fully process what Vincent was offering, he leaned closer and kissed her forehead with such tenderness that it took her breath away. "Your family now," he said quietly against her skin. "And I protect my family, always." Elena's relief about her mother's treatment was overwhelming, but it was tempered by a growing unease that had nothing to do with medical bills. 3 days after Vincent had arranged for her mother's care, Elena was driving to the hospital for visiting hours when she noticed the same blue sedan that had been behind her since leaving the estate. At first she told herself it was coincidence, that city traffic naturally created patterns, but when she took an unnecessary detour and the sedan followed, her stomach dropped with the realization that someone was deliberately following her. The hospital parking garage felt more isolated than usual as Elena hurried toward the elevators, her footsteps echoing off concrete walls in a way that made her hyper-aware of every shadow and corner. She was fumbling with her keys when a familiar voice made her freeze. "Well, well, well. Look who's living the high life now." Elena turned to find Derek standing between 2 parked cars, his appearance significantly worse than when she'd seen him near the gates. His clothes were wrinkled and stained, his hair unwashed, and his eyes held a wild quality that made Elena's pulse spike with fear. This wasn't the petty tyrant who'd made her work life miserable. This was someone who looked genuinely dangerous. "Derek, what are you doing here?" Elena asked, trying to keep her voice steady while she calculated the distance to the elevator and whether she could reach it before he could intercept her. "Just checking up on an old friend," Derek said, his voice carrying a sarcastic edge that made her skin crawl. "Heard your mama's getting some fancy new treatment. Must be nice having a sugar daddy with deep pockets." Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks, both from embarrassment and anger. Vincent's help with her mother's treatment was an act of kindness, not whatever sordid arrangement Derek was implying. "I don't know what you think you know about my situation," she said firmly, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "But my personal life is none of your business." Derek's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Personal life? Is that what we're calling it? Because from where I sit, it looks like little Elena Rossi found herself a meal ticket and decided to cash in. Wonder what your fancy boyfriend would think if he knew what kind of girl he's really keeping in that big house." The menace in Derek's voice made Elena take a step backward, her hand moving instinctively toward her phone. She'd never seen Derek like this before, so unhinged and desperate that she genuinely worried about what he might do. "Stay away from me, Derek," she said, her voice shaking despite her attempt to sound confident. "And stay away from my family." "Or what?" Derek asked, moving closer with a predatory smile that made Elena's blood run cold. "You'll tell your mobster boyfriend on me? You think I'm scared of Vincent Torino? I've done my research, sweetheart. I know exactly what kind of man you're sleeping with." Elena's phone was in her hand before she'd made a conscious decision to call for help, but Derek was faster than she'd expected. He grabbed her wrist hard enough to bruise, his fingers digging into her skin as he forced her to drop the phone. "We're not done talking," Derek hissed, his face inches from hers. "You cost me my job, my reputation, my whole life. You think you can just walk away and play house with some criminal while I lose everything?" Elena tried to pull away, but Derek's grip tightened painfully. She was opening her mouth to scream when another voice cut through the parking garage with deadly authority. "Let her go. Now." Vincent appeared from behind a pillar like a shadow made solid, his presence so commanding that Derek immediately released Elena's wrist and stepped backward. Elena had never been so relieved to see anyone in her entire life, but she was also confused about how Vincent had known to find her here. "This is a private conversation," Derek said. But his voice lacked conviction, and Elena could see fear creeping into his eyes as he took in Vincent's expression. Vincent moved to Elena's side with fluid grace, his hand coming to rest protectively on her lower back while his dark eyes remained fixed on Derek with an intensity that made the air itself seem dangerous. "You have exactly 10 seconds to leave this parking garage," Vincent said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of calm menace that was far more frightening than shouting. "And if I ever see you near Elena or her family again, if I even hear that you've been asking questions about them, I will consider it a direct threat against people under my protection." Derek's face went pale as the full implications of Vincent's words sank in. Elena could see him struggling between his anger and his survival instincts, and for a moment she wondered if he was desperate enough to do something truly stupid. "This isn't over," Derek said finally, backing toward his car with movements that tried to look casual but fooled no one. "Yes, it is," Vincent replied, and something in his tone made Derek move faster. They watched Derek drive away before Vincent turned his full attention to Elena, his hands moving to frame her face as he searched for signs of injury. "Are you hurt? Did he touch you?" Vincent's voice was tight with controlled fury, and Elena realized that beneath his calm exterior, he was absolutely enraged by what he'd witnessed. "I'm okay," Elena said, though her wrist was already bruising and her hands were shaking with delayed reaction. "How did you know where to find me?" Vincent's expression grew slightly uncomfortable. "I've had security watching you since the day you started working for me," he admitted. "When they reported that you were being followed, I came immediately." Elena felt a complex mix of gratitude and irritation at this revelation. "You've been having me watched? Without telling me?" Vincent's jaw tightened, and Elena could see him struggling between his protective instincts and his awareness that he'd overstepped boundaries. "Elena, the work I do, the enemies I have, they make everyone in my life a potential target," he said finally. "I should have told you, but I needed to know you were safe." The ride back to the estate was tense with unresolved issues that went far beyond Derek's harassment. Elena found herself questioning not just Vincent's methods but the entire situation she'd gotten herself into. When they arrived home and Vincent immediately disappeared into his office to make phone calls, Elena realized that her comfortable new life came with complications she'd never anticipated. It was Sophia who found Elena sitting in the kitchen an hour later, staring blankly at a cup of tea that had gone cold while she tried to process everything that had happened. "Are you sad about something?" Sophia asked, her young face serious with concern as she climbed onto the chair next to Elena's. Elena forced herself to smile, not wanting to burden the child with adult problems. Just thinking about some grown-up things, sweetheart. Nothing for you to worry about. Sophia studied her for a long moment with the perceptiveness that continued to surprise Elena. Papa gets that same look sometimes when he's worried about keeping us safe. The simple statement hit Elena with unexpected force. Here was an 80-year-old who already understood that her father's world contained dangers that required constant vigilance. And Elena realized that she'd been naive to think she could exist in Vincent's orbit without being touched by those same risks. When Vincent emerged from his office 2 hours later, he found Elena still in the kitchen, this time staring at papers spread across the table. He moved slowly, as if approaching a spooked animal, and Elena could feel his uncertainty about how to bridge the gap that Derek's confrontation had created between them. "I've made arrangements," Vincent said quietly, taking the seat across from her. "Derek won't be a problem anymore. His debts have been purchased by people who will ensure he leaves the state and stays gone." Elena looked up at him, trying to read his expression. What kind of debts? Vincent's hesitation told her everything she needed to know. The kind that men like Derek acquire when they try to solve their problems through gambling and borrowing from the wrong people. Elena felt a chill run down her spine as she realized the implications of what Vincent was telling her. "You're saying Derek owes money to dangerous people, and you've just put yourself in the position of controlling those debts." "I'm saying Derek is no longer your problem," Vincent replied evenly. "He's been relocated somewhere he can start fresh, with a clear understanding that his future depends on staying away from you." The casual way Vincent discussed manipulating people's lives should have terrified Elena, but instead she found herself marveling at the lengths he would go to protect her. This was the reality of Vincent's world, where problems were solved through power and influence rather than police reports and restraining orders. "Vincent," Elena said softly, reaching across the table to cover his hand with hers. "I need you to understand that I'm grateful for everything you've done, but I also need honesty between us. No more security details I don't know about, no more making decisions about my life without including me." Vincent's fingers threaded through hers, and Elena could see vulnerability in his expression that he rarely allowed anyone to witness. "You're right," he said simply. "I'm not good at this, Elena. I'm used to controlling situations completely, handling threats before they can touch the people I care about. But with you, I want to be better. I want to be the kind of man who deserves your trust." The sincerity in his voice made Elena's chest tighten with emotion she was no longer trying to deny. "Vincent, I need to tell you something," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What I feel for you, it's not gratitude or some kind of dependency because of what you've given me. It's real, and it's frightening, and I don't know how to handle it." Vincent's eyes darkened with an intensity that made Elena's pulse race. "Elena," he said, her name rough in his voice, "I've been falling in love with you since that first night when I watched you protect Sophia without a second thought for your own welfare. Everything I've done, every decision I've made about your mother's treatment, about Derek, about keeping you safe, it's because the thought of losing you terrifies me more than any enemy I've ever faced." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Elena could feel her heart pounding against her ribs as Vincent stood and moved around the table to stand beside her chair. "I love you too," she whispered, the words feeling both terrifying and inevitable as Vincent's hands came up to cup her face with infinite gentleness. When Vincent kissed her, Elena understood for the first time why people wrote songs and poetry about falling in love. His lips were warm and soft against hers, and the kiss tasted like coming home to a place she'd never known she was looking for. When they broke apart, Elena could see her own wonder reflected in Vincent's dark eyes. "I want to be with you," Elena said, surprising herself with her boldness. "Really be with you? Not just as Sophia's nanny or as someone you're protecting. I want to be yours." Vincent's response was to lift her from her chair and carry her toward the stairs, his movements gentle but purposeful. Elena had dreamed about this moment but had never imagined it would feel so natural, so right, as if every decision in her life had led her to this place with this man. In Vincent's bedroom, surrounded by evidence of his wealth and power, but focused entirely on the tenderness in his touch, Elena gave herself completely to the love that had been building between them since their first meeting. Vincent worshipped her body with a patience and devotion that brought tears to her eyes. And when they finally came together completely, Elena understood that she was no longer just Elena Rossi trying to survive in a difficult world. She was Vincent Torino's woman, and she was exactly where she belonged. Elena woke in Vincent's arms to the sound of her phone ringing with the urgent insistence that meant bad news. The bedroom was still dark, dawn hours away, and Vincent stirred beside her as she fumbled for the device on his nightstand. The caller ID showed her mother's hospital, and Elena's stomach dropped with immediate dread. "Miss Rossi, this is Dr. Martinez at Mercy General. I'm afraid there's been an incident with your mother." Elena sat up quickly, her heart pounding as Vincent's hand came to rest protectively on her back. "What kind of incident? Is she hurt?" "She's missing from her room. Security footage shows a man in scrubs entering around midnight, but when the nurses checked on her at 2 a.m., her bed was empty. There were signs of a struggle." The phone nearly slipped from Elena's trembling fingers as the implications hit her. Someone had taken her mother from the hospital, and Elena knew with terrible certainty who was responsible. Derek hadn't been relocated. Derek had been planning something far worse than a confrontation in a parking garage. Vincent was already reaching for his own phone before Elena finished the call, his movements sharp with controlled urgency as he processed what he'd overheard. Elena's phone rang again immediately, an unknown number that made her stomach twist with dread. "Answer it," Vincent said quietly, his dark eyes grim but focused. "Put it on speaker." Elena's hands shook as she accepted the call, and Derek's voice filled the room with venomous satisfaction. "Did you really think your boyfriend could make me disappear?" Derek laughed, the sound harsh and unhinged. "I've got your precious mama, Elena. She's alive for now, but that depends entirely on whether you're smart enough to follow instructions." Elena felt tears threatening but forced herself to speak clearly. "What do you want, Derek?" "What I want is for you to understand what it feels like to lose everything because of someone else's choices," Derek said, his voice carrying the kind of rage that came from months of festering resentment. "You destroyed my life, cost me everything I worked for, and now I want you to feel what that's like." Vincent was already moving, pulling on clothes with efficient speed while speaking rapidly into his own phone in Italian. Elena caught enough words to understand he was mobilizing people, calling in resources, treating this like the military operation it had become. "Here's how this works," Derek continued. "You come alone to the old warehouse on Harbor Street, the one by the docks. Come alone, Elena, or your mother dies. If I see any of Torino's people, if I even suspect you told him about this call, she's dead." The call ended, leaving Elena staring at Vincent with fear and desperation warring in her chest. Every instinct screamed that she should rush to the warehouse immediately, that any delay could cost her mother her life. But looking at Vincent's face, she realized she had a choice that would define not just this crisis but her entire future. "Tell me you're not thinking about going there alone," Vincent said, his voice deadly quiet as he read her expression. Elena took a shaky breath, feeling the weight of decision settling on her shoulders. 3 months ago, she would have gone to that warehouse without hesitation, would have tried to handle the crisis herself rather than risk involving anyone else in her problems. But 3 months ago, she'd been a different person, someone who'd never experienced the security of being truly protected and loved. "I'm not going alone," she said firmly, reaching for Vincent's hands and holding them tightly. "But Vincent, he has my mother. Whatever you're planning, whatever you need to do, just please make sure she's safe." Vincent's expression shifted to something fierce and protective that made Elena's pulse race for entirely different reasons. He pulled her against his chest, holding her with a strength that felt like he could shield her from the entire world. "Elena, listen to me very carefully. Derek has made the worst mistake of his pathetic life by threatening someone I love. My people are already moving, and within an hour we'll know everything about that warehouse, every entrance, every possible escape route, every advantage we can exploit." Elena felt some of her panic ease as Vincent's calm competence washed over her. This was the side of his world she'd only glimpsed before, the machinery of power and protection that operated beyond normal law enforcement but with ruthless efficiency. "What about the police?" she asked, though she already suspected what Vincent's answer would be. Vincent's jaw tightened slightly. The police would treat this as a kidnapping, which means negotiation and careful protocol and a significant chance that Derek becomes desperate enough to hurt your mother. My way ensures Derek never threatens anyone again. Elena realized she was looking directly into the heart of Vincent's world, the place where violence was a tool used to protect the people he loved. She should have been horrified, should have insisted on calling proper authorities, but all she felt was grateful that Derek had chosen to threaten someone under Vincent Torino's protection. The next hour passed in a blur of controlled chaos as Vincent's people moved with military precision. Elena watched from Vincent's office as men arrived at the estate, serious-faced individuals who spoke in rapid Italian and studied building schematics with the expertise of people who'd done this kind of thing many times before. Within 40 minutes, Vincent had a complete tactical assessment of the warehouse, including the information that Derek wasn't working alone but had hired 2 other desperate men to help him. Elena insisted on going with the rescue team despite Vincent's arguments, and after a tense discussion, he agreed she could wait in the car while his people handled the actual confrontation. The warehouse district was dark and industrial, filled with shadows and empty buildings that seemed designed for exactly this kind of criminal activity. Elena's heart pounded as Vincent's team moved into position, and she found herself praying to a god she wasn't sure she believed in that her mother would survive this night. The confrontation itself was brief and decisive. Elena heard shouting, then a few sharp sounds that might have been gunshots, then silence that seemed to stretch forever. When Vincent emerged from the warehouse carrying her mother in his arms, Elena felt tears of relief streaming down her face as she ran toward them. Her mother was unconscious but breathing, drugged but unharmed according to the paramedic Vincent had waiting. As the ambulance took her mother back to the hospital for observation, Elena turned to Vincent with questions she wasn't sure she wanted answered. "Derek?" she asked simply. Vincent's expression was grim but satisfied. He won't be bothering anyone ever again. His associates have been convinced to relocate to different continents, and the situation is permanently resolved. Elena knew she should probably ask for more details, should want to understand exactly what permanent resolution meant in Vincent's world, but all she felt was overwhelming gratitude that the threat was finally over. For the first time since Derek had first harassed her at the restaurant months ago, Elena could breathe freely knowing he could never hurt her or anyone she loved again. Over the following days, as her mother recovered and the traumatic events faded into memory, Elena found herself marveling at how completely her life had changed. She was no longer the exhausted waitress struggling to pay bills and wondering if she'd ever achieve her dreams. She was a woman who'd found love with a powerful man who would move heaven and earth to protect her, and she was helping to raise a little girl who'd become like her own daughter. It was during one of their evening conversations, a week after the warehouse incident, that Vincent surprised her with a question that stopped her heart completely. They were sitting on the terrace overlooking the gardens, Sophia asleep upstairs and the house peaceful around them, when Vincent turned to Elena with an expression that was both nervous and determined. "Elena," he said, taking her hands in his with the same gentleness he'd shown since their first night together. "These past months with you have been the happiest of my adult life. You've brought joy and warmth to this house that I never thought we'd experience again, and you've shown Sophia what it means to be truly loved and cared for." Elena felt her breath catch as Vincent shifted to kneel beside her chair, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket that made her heart race with anticipation and disbelief. "I know my world is complicated and sometimes dangerous," Vincent continued, his dark eyes serious and vulnerable. "I know that loving me means accepting risks and responsibilities that most people never face. But Elena, I can't imagine my life without you in it. Will you marry me? Will you be my wife and Sophia's mother and the center of everything that matters to me?" Elena stared at the ring Vincent was offering her, a stunning piece that caught the moonlight and threw it back in brilliant flashes. The diamond was substantial but elegant, clearly chosen by someone who understood her taste perfectly, and Elena realized that Vincent had been planning this proposal for some time. "Yes," she whispered, tears streaming down her face as Vincent slipped the ring onto her finger. "Yes, of course, yes. I love you and Sophia more than I ever thought possible, and I want to spend the rest of my life being part of your family." Vincent's smile was radiant as he stood and pulled Elena into his arms, spinning her around the terrace while she laughed with pure joy. When he set her down, they were both crying and laughing simultaneously, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they were promising each other. The kiss that followed was different from any they'd shared before, charged with the weight of permanent commitment and the promise of a future together. When they broke apart, Elena could see her own wonder and happiness reflected in Vincent's eyes. "I want to adopt Sophia officially," Elena said, surprising herself with the words that came straight from her heart. "I want her to be legally mine as well as yours, so she never has to worry about losing another parent." Vincent's expression grew tender as he cupped Elena's face in his hands. "She's been hoping you'd want that," he said softly. "She asked me last week if you would still live with us forever even if you got tired of being her nanny. I told her that some people become family not because they have to but because they choose to, and that's the strongest kind of family there is." Elena felt her heart overflow with love for both Vincent and Sophia. These two people who'd given her everything she'd ever wanted and so much more than she'd ever dared to hope for. Have you ever experienced a moment when you realized your entire life had led you to exactly where you were supposed to be? When someone offered you a love so complete it changed everything you thought you knew about happiness? Share your thoughts with me in the comments about second chances and finding unexpected love in the most unlikely places. 6 months later, Elena stood in the estate's garden wearing a simple but elegant wedding dress and watching Sophia scatter rose petals with the serious concentration of someone who'd been practicing for weeks. The ceremony was small but perfect, attended by Vincent's mother Isabella, Elena's recovered mother, and a handful of Vincent's closest associates who looked remarkably respectable in wedding attire. When Sophia reached the altar carrying Elena's bouquet with obvious pride, Elena felt tears threaten as she realized this little girl was about to officially become her daughter. The adoption papers had been finalized the week before, but today would make their family complete in every possible way. Vincent looked magnificent in his tailored tuxedo, but it was his expression that took Elena's breath away. He was looking at her like she was the most precious thing in his world, like he couldn't quite believe his good fortune in winning her love, and Elena felt her heart skip with the same wonder she'd experienced during their first conversation in the restaurant. The vows they'd written themselves spoke of protection and partnership, of choosing each other despite the complications of Vincent's world, of creating a home where love mattered more than anything else. When Vincent promised to honor and cherish Elena for the rest of his life, his voice broke with emotion that made everyone present understand they were witnessing something extraordinary. Elena's vows focused on the courage Vincent had shown in opening his heart to love again, on her commitment to being the mother Sophia deserved, and on her gratitude for finding a man whose strength made her feel safe enough to be vulnerable. When she promised to stand beside Vincent through whatever challenges their future might hold, she meant every word with the fierce conviction of someone who discovered what real love could accomplish. The kiss that sealed their marriage was tender and joyful, witnessed by their small family and blessed by a love that had transformed all their lives. As rice and rose petals fell around them like gentle rain, Elena realized she'd never imagined happiness this complete was possible. 2 years later, Elena was teaching Sophia how to make homemade pasta in the kitchen of their estate when Vincent came home from a business trip to find his wife and daughters covered in flour and laughing at some private joke. Sophia, now 10 and thriving in every way that mattered, immediately abandoned her cooking to launch herself into Vincent's arms with the enthusiasm of someone who'd missed him terribly. "How are my girls?" Vincent asked, holding Sophia while his eyes found Elena across the kitchen with the same love and desire that had characterized their relationship since the beginning. Elena smiled and placed her hand on her rounded belly, 6 months pregnant with their first biological child together, but already the mother of Sophia in every way that mattered. She'd graduated from nursing school the year before and now worked part-time at a clinic that served underprivileged families, using her experiences with struggle and recovery to help others facing their own crises. "We're perfect," Elena said simply, moving into Vincent's embrace and feeling his arm come around both her and Sophia. The kitchen around them was warm with the smells of dinner and the sounds of family, exactly the kind of domestic happiness that Elena had dreamed of but never thought she'd achieve. Vincent kissed the top of her head, then Sophia's, before cupping Elena's face and kissing her with a tenderness that made her remember their first kiss on the terrace and every moment of joy that had followed. "I love you, Mrs. Torino," he said softly, using the name that still made Elena's heart skip with happiness. "I love you too," Elena replied, looking around at their beautiful life and feeling grateful beyond words for the courage she'd shown that night in the restaurant when she'd chosen to protect a stranger's child. Sometimes the most extraordinary love stories begin with the simplest acts of kindness, and sometimes defending someone else's happiness leads to finding your own. As Elena watched Vincent help Sophia finish preparing dinner while he told them stories about his trip, she realized that every difficult moment of her past had led her to this perfect present, where she was exactly who she'd always been meant to be. A woman who'd found her home in the heart of a man who loved her completely, and a mother raising children who would grow up knowing they were precious beyond measure. Outside, rain began to fall gently against the windows, but inside the estate that had become their sanctuary, the Torino family was warm and safe and together, surrounded by a love that had proven stronger than every threat and more enduring than any challenge they might face. Elena had found her forever in the most unexpected place, with the most unlikely man, and she knew that whatever the future might bring, she would face it surrounded by the family she'd chosen and the love that had chosen her in return.